Nico, if you're ready, you're good to go.
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, good, thanks. Okay then, so hi everybody and thanks for joining our Unravel the SD-WAN Marketplace with MBA IT and Avant. Very much appreciated. So we've put this webinar together really just to identify and have an open conversation around our relationship with Avant and the work that we're doing with those guys in terms of our partnership relationships across the SD-WAN vendors that we're working with, and really to give you a deeper insight into the SD-WAN marketplace today and the potential players that we're working with that could potentially, look to deliver a service for you for SD-WAN. Obviously, SD-WAN is a emerging market that's really come to the forefront over the past 2 to 3 years, and what we're really seeing now is customers looking to develop that sort of hybrid cloud scenario, and with that hybrid cloud scenario, sort of wanting to make those applications more agile, and that's really where SD-WAN can come into play, and look to reduce costs around your MPLS global networks, as well as enable you to be able to have that sort of manageability across your environment and visibility across your environment over what was just the MPLS network that we always sort of love and know. So that in the heart of it is what we're going to do today. I will hand over to the guys at Avant, and at the end, what I'll do is I'll just talk a brief talk about the sort of future engagement and how we work with Avant and yourselves as customers, just so that we can sort of iron out that engagement process on the end of the webinar. So, Rob, I'll hand over to you, Rob, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jay. Yep, just by way of introduction, I'm Rob Merhej. I'm the Director of Channel Sales for Avant in the UK. And with me, I have Nico O'Hara, who is our SE Director, who's based in our head office in Chicago. Well, not today, actually. He's at home in Chicago, of course, as we all are, but that's where he's based. So we're going to be taking you through our take on SD-WAN and the marketplace. Nico's going to take you through all of the different players in the market and the benefits and the differentiators between each one. So with that, I'd like to pass over to Nico, and he can take it away from here.
Awesome. So thank you, Rob and Jay, and everyone on the webinar today. Good to meet you virtually. If you have questions, definitely chime in. Rob and Jay, are we going to do questions live or just in the chat? How do you want to handle that?
I think at the end.
I'm going to be honest though, if there's something that comes up, guys, anybody that is watching, please use the question and answer function that we have, and if there's something that's really relevant, Nico, that we feel as though we can answer straight off the bat, then if you don't mind, and we can sort of make an assessment, and if it's something that's relevant that we can just iron out, maybe we can just quickly jump into that if needs be, if that's all right.
Sure.
Good.
All
okay,
right.
Thank you.
Without further ado, I'll jump into it. I apologize in advance if you see either of my dogs walking around in the background, but here we are. So with that being said, I'll just dive right in. So starting with just a kind of very high level definition here, you're all probably familiar to varying degrees with SD-WAN, software defined wide area network. And if we think about it, what we're really trying to do is simplify the WAN, make it more intelligent and more resilient or redundant so that we can avoid downtime and intelligently steer traffic along the best types of connectivity. So if you're familiar with the concept of virtualization within the data center, abstracting away the servers and just kind of putting workloads on the right hardware, at that point in time and avoiding failures and so on, that's kind of the same concept, but we're just applying that to the network instead of within the data center. So obviously there's a ton of stats on this slide. I'm not going to hit on every single one, but really the important takeaways here are SD-WAN is a big deal. It's kind of a buzzword, and businesses are looking at it, either deploying it now, getting into proof of concepts, or planning to deploy it within the next 24 months. But many businesses and internal IT teams within companies aren't necessarily confident of how to deploy SD-WAN. They're not necessarily familiar with the ins and outs of the technology as they might be with traditional routing or MPLS networks. And so the vast majority of clients are going with either a managed or co-managed approach, leaning on the SD-WAN provider or a carrier or an MSP to kind of help them, at the very least, implement a solution and potentially, co-manage it moving forward, leaning on that expertise. So as we kind of talk through this.
Sorry,
Yep.
Nico, just to labour this point, guys. Obviously, in this scenario, and what we do with Avant, Avant are our preferred hosted referral partner that we work with for all hosted SD-WAN solutions. MBA as a business, if host isn't something that you're looking to do, and you're looking to do that private dedicated with those sort of tier one vendors, then MBA as a business have been deploying SD-WAN globally now for, well, best part of 2 or 3 years. And, you know, we've undertaken a number of various different projects in different countries, and we have that full engineering team that can assist and aid in the procurement of that hardware that's required, and then the installation and implementation globally. So, you know, this is a focus today is around the hosted market, and if it's something that you want to do around the on-premise dedicated, then just come and talk to your account managers, and we can help through that process as well. Thanks. Cheers, Nico.
Yeah, great point, Jay. So we've kind of got either option covered, but just as far as the trends go, you know, there's a lot of management going on initially, and certainly the do-it-yourself model is also out there, and definitely something we can address. And over time, we kind of expect that to, you know, management to decrease and sort of self-service to increase as businesses get more familiar with SD-WAN. But really the important takeaway is that it's disruptive, it's happening. You know, the growth rate is increasing, whereas routers are actually decreasing year over year. And it's a very big market in the billions of pounds or dollars. And lastly, you know, we talk about kind of the death of MPLS and replacement of MPLS, but really within the enterprise, you know, we're seeing MPLS actually still increase and investment within it for the smaller and mid-market business, potentially decreasing and being replaced by internet along with SD-WAN as sort of a cost savings play. So within SD-WAN, there's several different key components that really any SD-WAN solution should have and be able to address. So the first being that it's transport agnostic. So kind of the key with SD-WAN is that regardless of what type of connectivity we may put into a particular office or what may be available, we still want to be able to leverage that connection, that circuit within an overall SD-WAN network. And as we're doing that, I'm going to jump around a little bit on this slide, but we want to be able to take intelligent measurements across those different paths. So if we have 2 or 3 circuits at a given site, we want to know which one is performing the best at a given point in time and be able to then select the best path for a given application. So the solution needs to be application aware. We need to be able to identify this is voice traffic, this is video, you know, this is Netflix or YouTube or whatever the case may be, this is email. So we can kind of prioritize those different applications and then put each one on the best possible path for it based on that priority. So we're going to make sure, you know, voice, business voice, and video gets the best possible path with the lowest latency, lowest packet loss, least congestion. And then from there, we can kind of choose the better path for different applications and maybe put that less critical traffic on a path that isn't performing as well. And along with that comes kind of the simplicity and the visibility. So the simplicity to kind of make those initial configurations, and some of that can even be automated, and then just sort of let the solution go. So we've got the different paths, we've got the different applications, and now SD-WAN is going to essentially automate that for you and just at any point in time kind of continue to make those decisions without you needing to go in and actually do anything manually. It's more about the configuration than it is about potentially the ongoing management. And along with that, you're able to get visibility into all of those different circuits and those applications to see at any point in time, or historically via reporting how your applications are performing, how your network is performing, you know, are your carriers delivering upon the SLAs that they're promising to you, and are your users getting an acceptable experience accessing the applications that they need on the corporate side. And the overlay kind of just comes back to the definition of SD-WAN. You know, we have all of these different components, these different circuits at all of our various locations, and SD-WAN is kind of abstracting all of that to create one virtualized network. So if we look at sort of the before and after within a given network, so we've got a very simplified network here with a data center and 2 remote offices. And so we're potentially leveraging, you know, maybe this is MPLS or VPLS, some kind of private network, or it's internet with VPN. But the way this looks right now and the way it works is that the offices connect back to the data center for their applications. And then if they need to get out to the internet, they're potentially backhauling that traffic to the data center as well, and then going out maybe a centralized firewall to get to, whether it's actual corporate Amazon or Azure or Salesforce, Office 365, or whether it's just sort of generic, potentially personal internet traffic getting to, Facebook or YouTube or whatever the case may be. Now, with many clients and businesses in general, there's going to be some kind of backup network here, and maybe this is broadband, or maybe this is, actual Ethernet internet. But for the most part, this may not be in use, 95% of the time. Maybe it's just used to split off some of that non-corporate traffic, or it's used for guest Wi-Fi. And maybe then if there's a complete failure on that active network somewhere, then the backup network kicks in. Maybe that's automated. Maybe there's some manual configuration required. But really the important takeaway is that it's only that. It's only a backup network. So yes, it's being paid for, but most of the time it's not being utilized. So if we now introduce SD-WAN here, you can see that we've got these SD-WAN devices at each of these sites. And right now they're sitting kind of non-disruptively with the routers and the WAN edge hardware that's already in place. But now we've taken the concept of a backup network and we've sort of eliminated that. We've made 2 active networks now. So we don't really care anymore which was sort of primary and which was secondary. We're just going to treat every link almost independently and just say, treat them all equally and just look at, with SD-WAN, how are they performing right now? From site A to the data center, which is the best path for me based on loss, latency, congestion, jitter, and let's take that path for a given application. And 1 second from now, or a certain number of milliseconds from now even, is that condition still true? If not, maybe we need to move the application over to the other circuit, depending on the type of application, if that would be disruptive to a session or not. But with that being said, we're able to leverage all of the bandwidth that we have available and really maximize, get the most out of our investment in the network and improve performance, improve resilience by doing so, moving applications non-disruptively to the better path, and end users aren't able to really tell the difference. If anything, they're just getting better performance out of the network. And lastly, we've kind of taken that cloud component, those internet applications, and moved them over to the middle here because there's not necessarily a need to backhaul those to a data center anymore. You can do local breakout, you can sort of split tunnel, identifying some of the applications that maybe are trusted or non-corporate that you want to push out locally and avoid that backhaul, avoid that sort of tax on your network, especially if it is, potentially an expensive MPLS network where you don't want to bog it down with a lot of internet traffic. And I guess I just kind of addressed that already, so we'll keep going. So if we put this into sort of a simple analogy here, before SD-WAN, we had the MapQuests of the world, to get me from point A to point B. We had MapQuest, we had Apple Maps, for example. And if we think about this in context of a network, we have a network today, and each router can kind of only make a decision 1 step ahead, and then it passes it to the next router in the network, and so on and so forth. But we don't really have that holistic view from end to end to be able to say, is this MPLS network or is this internet network any better or worse than my second connection at a given location? So the view is kind of limited. That intelligence and that visibility doesn't cover our entire network and all the different applications that we have, the different circuits and paths that we have available. So if we look at, this is actually the Apple Maps icon that they eventually changed, but it looks kind of like, we're taking an overpass here and then we're just driving right through the barrier onto the highway. And so if we move forward in time now, we have applications like Waze and even Google Maps to some degree, where they're giving you real-time updates. Hey, there's a construction ahead, or there's an accident. So instead of just taking the normal route based on distance and speed limit, maybe you need to get off of the highway and take some back roads for a couple blocks and then get back on, and you're actually going to get to your destination a lot faster. But 10 minutes from now, that may not be the case, and it might tell the next person in line, actually we're going this different path, or we will take the highway. And if we kind of abstract that and translate that to SD-WAN, it's almost exactly the same. We're telling the traffic in real time, here's what the best path is for you. And then for the next point in time, that may not be the case for telling the next traffic or the next application or the next session. You need to go on this different path because it's overall going to deliver a better experience. So looking at this sort of a little bit in the weeds, a little bit in detail here, there's a quick example here. We've got site A and site B. We've got two types of traffic, maybe a phone call here and some kind of application. Maybe this is a CRM, for example. And the phone call is taking this private link, which is, let's say that's MPLS, and the CRM traffic here is going over the internet. So on the left, the top left, we can see what the requirements are for that phone call. We need to make sure that acceptable performance is delivered. So we don't want more than 1% of loss, 30 milliseconds of jitter, and so on. And the CRM here also has thresholds. It also has requirements to deliver acceptable performance, but they're not necessarily as stringent as the phone call. So then on the right side here, we can see how are these networks actually performing? How's the MPLS network performing? How's the internet network performing? And right now, everything is sort of within SLAs, within those business policies for these applications. So end users are getting an acceptable performance right now. But at the next snapshot in time here, maybe that's a second later, maybe that's the next packet, maybe it's 100 milliseconds later, whatever the case may be. Now we can see that the actual performance on this internet path here went down. So there's 3% loss right now. And if we look at these requirements for that CRM, it can really only tolerate 2% loss at most. So the SD-WAN solution is looking at that, taking those measurements and realizing, okay, we need to move this CRM traffic. It's not acceptable right now. And so we're going to place it on this other path, the private network, to deliver that acceptable performance, get it back within policy. And this is all sort of transparent to the end user. They don't realize that the network wasn't performing well. IT isn't getting a bunch of phone calls from people who are complaining about access to Microsoft Dynamics or whatever that application is. It's sort of all transparent. It all happens automatically. And of course, this is assuming that there was bandwidth on that private network to actually take this additional traffic. But you can imagine as we sort of expand this out, now we have 20 sites and we have 50 applications and we have many different circuits at every single site. So there's all these different paths going on. And the beauty of SD-WAN is we kind of just set those policies once, and then SD-WAN takes all the measurements, makes all the decisions in real time, and everything ideally is performing at an acceptable level, or even significantly better than that without necessarily having to go in and do anything, proactively. So I think you can probably also imagine, just based on what we've talked about so far, some of the reasons and maybe some of the drivers that you're looking at for why businesses would move to SD-WAN. Part of that is just the fact that applications are moving outside of the data center. More and more are moving into the cloud, whether it's AWS and Azure, it's sort of a SaaS model. So there's less and less of a reason to backhaul traffic on a private network to a data center. Maybe in the past, 100% of your applications were in a data center. Now maybe it's only 50%. And so you're potentially decreasing performance by sending applications back to a data center and then out to the internet by adding that additional latency. And there's also the fact that you're putting sort of performance tax on your private network. Maybe there's it's a couple megabits per site, or maybe it's 10 megabits, 20 megabits, but you may not have enough bandwidth on a given private circuit to support all the traffic, including all this internet traffic and cloud-based traffic. And you're actually using that link, you're using an MPLS link at the branch office, again at the data center, and then an internet path out of the data center. So you're essentially paying for that traffic 3 times. Whereas if you were to break that out locally, identify the application, send it out to internet, then you really only pay that tax once on that internet link, and you avoid all that additional latency. So SD-WAN is able to accomplish those things, moving more towards internet and application awareness. And then there's the cost savings piece, which we find is what kind of gets businesses in the door and gets them excited about SD-WAN, not necessarily always something that translates to the end solution, because in some cases, maybe it's cost parity, but we've added significant bandwidth redundancy to the network and get a much better performing network at the same cost. So it can kind of be either one, just depending on what the end goal is and which of these other benefits we're trying to achieve. The performance aspect of it kind of goes, without saying based on just what we've talked about, but having multiple paths, having the intelligence to select the best path for a given application means you can avoid outages on the network. and you're taking those measurements, you know which path is best. So you can also avoid sort of brownouts. You can avoid poor performance as well as just completely down networks, which would be kind of a blackout. So there's the intelligence to make that decision regardless of whether the circuit is down or just performing poorly. And then the other kind of pieces here, just simplifying the management of the network, being able to make changes in one place in sort of the controller or the orchestrator. You can go in and make a change for a site or for an application, or for you know, sort of a priority level that you're applying, and that can get rolled out to all of the locations within a template, and you don't have to necessarily go log into every single site or log into a router, get into command line. It's relatively straightforward. It's more application oriented than it is sort of router and network protocol oriented. And the last two here, time to deploy and big bandwidth, those are more so related to internet over private networks. So it's generally much, much quicker to get internet circuits delivered to a new location, especially if we're talking about, you know, acquisitions, for example, where sites already probably have internet, but it might take months or at least many weeks to get a private circuit delivered. So with SD-WAN, we can throw in an SD-WAN appliance and leverage those existing internet circuits. And then because of that, you know, we're able to potentially increase bandwidth significantly for often the same cost as an MPLS circuit. And because we're adding the redundancy of multiple internet circuits, we're ideally getting the same or even better performance than what we might have from a private network, because we're able to look at those circuits in real time and select the best path. So when we talk about different providers of SD-WAN, you've kind of got three overall buckets. We've got sort of these standalone vendors. These are the ones that are building their own technology. And here we're kind of highlighting some of the ones that we work with: Ariaka, CloudGenix, Cisco, et cetera, VMware for VeloCloud. And with those vendors, it can often be a sort of standalone do-it-yourself model where you kind of get the technology, you go ahead and implement it, and you sort of do that on your own. You're not really beholden to anyone or any circuits. You can just deploy it across any network and any carrier that you may have in place. Jay, was there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, just a quick one on the vendor side of things, just for the sort of standalone vendors. Pretty much some of the vendors that we have listed there, we as a business, we are partnered. And rather than me listing them, if you look at the top right quadrant, top right hand corner of you know, the standard top right hand corner quadrant, then the expected vendors that you'd expect to see there, we're working with still today. So, you know, those vendors are not only the vendors that we work with all of the other tier one vendors as well for that sort of standalone piece. Awesome,
great point. So definitely this isn't the full list. This is just kind of a quick snapshot. And as we move into those two buckets on the right side there, the carriers and the MSPs, this is where we get into more of that managed or co-managed approach, potentially, you know, one provider to source different components of the solution. So you might argue, you know, well, that defeats the purpose of SD-WAN, right? I want to be carrier agnostic. I want to be able to rip out one carrier tomorrow and put in a different one and sort of be in full control of that without being beholden to anyone else besides my, you know, my SD-WAN technology. And I'd say, yeah, you know, that's a great point. It really comes down to why you're moving to SD-WAN and what you're looking to get out of it. So in some cases, if the answer is simplicity and sort of one throat to choke or one back to pat, you can look at an aggregator or potentially a carrier who can come in and source primary, you know, fiber circuits, sort of the backup broadband cable, for example, and then maybe even a tertiary of LTE along with the SD-WAN solution. And they can be sort of that single bill, that single point of contact and support. Whenever there's a problem, you reach out to them and they handle it no matter, you know, what circuit or whether it's the SD-WAN solution. So there's kind of pros and cons to both approaches. And then there's obviously the management aspect, whether you're doing it yourself, whether you're looking at more of a co-managed option or a fully managed solution, either from the implementation side or ongoing. So as we, I think I touched on probably most of this, but the last piece I'll highlight here is that when you talk about the actual technology, you know, obviously on the standalone side, we're really talking about vendors who have built their own technology from the ground up. So if you want to be on the latest and greatest version of the software with access to every single feature, then that's really the way you want to go. When you look at a carrier or an MSP, you know, generally they're supporting a couple different technologies, and they're going to make sure that they've tested out the technology they want to make sure that it's sort of stable and able to be rolled out across their customers. So there's a pros and cons to that. They may not be on the latest version, the latest refresh cycle that you might want access to, but they are going to ensure that it's completely bug-free before they roll it out to their client base. And as we go kind of one last level further there, sort of between the carrier and the aggregator or the MSP, generally we find that the carrier often wants to include the network, because it's a defensive play for them, right? They don't want to lose that spend on their private network. And they'll often standardize on one or two or maybe three different solutions because they want it to be fairly straightforward, right? They want to just add that onto a network sale, and they might limit the features that are available because it's going to be very standardized. Whereas an MSP or a circuit aggregator, they tend to be a little bit more flexible. They might support 3 or 4 or 5 different SD-WAN solutions and be very much open to supporting different features, kind of custom per client versus saying just kind of here's the package, small, medium, large within a certain technology. And they can source potentially additional circuits from other carriers and kind of be that full comprehensive solution. On the flip side of that, there is an aspect of potential concern if they support 5 or 6 different SD-WAN technologies. You at least want to do your homework and make sure, all right, well, do they actually support all of these and manage all of these today? Or are they just saying we can do it? Do they have an existing client base on the technology that you're interested in? One potential benefit of going that route is that, you have one provider to support multiple technologies. So if you find that one technology doesn't particularly work, they can potentially swap it out with another and, still remain on that same contract with the same support and the same potentially aggregated circuits. So when we talk about selecting the right SD-WAN solution, there's many components that go into that. And these are some of the things that we look at when we help clients to make a decision about the right both technology and the right solution provider, which can be 2 different things. But we want to look at several components, and this is just sort of a short list of those, but looking at the contracts that are in place, the carriers, and how long those contracts extend for, whether those are private or public circuits, and kind of what we have to work with in the next 6 months, 12 months, or 24 or 36 months. We also want to look at geography, where those circuits are located. If we're talking about sort of a strictly regional play, or if we're going across countries, across continents, certain SD-WAN solutions perform much better or worse depending on which of those geographic elements that we need to consider. And the same goes for contracts. Some perform much better with private networks than others, and that really comes down to the architecture of those solutions. And then we get into the applications that are in scope. Some solutions will perform much better with voice, for example, than others, and some will also perform better for cloud or hosted applications than those that are on premises. So that's an important conversation to have. Then we talk about the managed services that we've already alluded to a little bit, whether that solution is going to be self-service, whether it's going to be co-managed or fully managed, and then also for the circuit element, whether those circuits at the last mile, if you're looking for someone to help you manage all the circuits and do proactive troubleshooting and contacting the carrier, or whether maybe you only have 1 or 2 carriers and you'll handle that in-house. That's not really something that you need. That again kind of goes to the selection of, is it just a vendor or is it a carrier or an MSP? And lastly here, what we'll touch on at least for this slide, the security components, whether you need a next-gen firewall or a basic firewall, what that architecture will look like at every site within the data center, whether we need to look at maybe a cloud or a hosted solution for the firewall. Then the form factor component, just do we need to deploy physical edge devices, or do we have to be concerned about placing virtual edges in a VMware environment, AWS or Azure? And lastly, links and capacity is kind of just touching on how many circuits are we looking at per site, what's the size of those circuits, how much bandwidth. Certain SD-WAN solutions can only support, maybe 2 circuits and LTE at max. And so those aren't the ones that we want to look at when you have 3 or 4 circuits in a data center. And same thing with capacity. Some solutions may max out at 1 gig or 2 gigs of bandwidth, and you don't want to necessarily limit your connectivity if you have much larger circuits. So some of the trends that we're seeing within the SD-WAN market, obviously it's very quickly evolving. And Gartner, in their WAN Edge infrastructure report, they had, I think, roughly 20 different vendors in that report. we expect that to continue to consolidate. We've already seen Cisco acquiring Viptela, and they had previously obviously acquired Meraki, Oracle acquiring Talari, Palo Alto just acquired CloudGenix recently, and so we'll expect to see Palo Alto's existing SD-WAN strategy kind of collapse and be replaced with the CloudGenix model. And additionally, there was VMware acquiring VeloCloud. So we continue to see some of those smaller players either get driven out of the market or acquired and sort of consolidated into an existing offering. And then there's also the element of just sort of migration. So as we talk about SD-WAN, how it can kind of steer around brownouts, just poor performance in the network, it actually can be a great migration tool moving away from one network into another, because you can put SD-WAN in place, do that path selection of those measurements and configuration and all of that, get that up and running, and then potentially remove some of the circuits in the network while replacing them with, maybe replacing private circuits with public circuits. And the SD-WAN solution can just kind of continue steering around everything as it was before. If that network is down or unplugged, it will avoid it. And as you add the other circuits, or maybe you do that in the reverse order, it'll continue to select the best path. So it can be a really great migration tool when you're moving away from a legacy network into, a more modern network. And we're continuing to see, the trend for managed services, as we talked about, partnerships and integrations between SD-WAN providers and, firewall and security vendors, along with hosted application providers, or Azure or AWS for virtual WAN. So there's a lot more integration and partnership going on, and that sort of ties back to the vendor consolidation element. But really, as these solutions get more standardized and there are fewer of them, they'll continue to sort of work better with a lot of the other solutions that are already in the marketplace. And I think we touched on this a little bit, but SD-WAN doesn't always mean the end of MPLS, right? They can work sort of cohesively, and you can layer on an SD-WAN solution with an MPLS solution. MPLS could be that primary circuit, and you could have internet as your backup, and you could layer on SD-WAN and sort of intelligently select between those paths, not leveraging MPLS when it's maybe not the best path to do local breakout for a cloud application, or if it just happens to be performing poorly, you can steer around it and leverage the internet link. So depending on the solution provider that you're looking at, and again, some of the carriers and some of the aggregators, they might have a stance where they're perfectly fine working with MPLS and everything goes very smoothly. But then as you start to move sort of along the spectrum here from left to right, some of the carriers obviously might be less friendly to working with a different carrier's MPLS. And then on the far right here, depending on the provider, some of the SD-WAN solutions actually have their own private network, their own core network that you're sort of connecting into, and they're typically not going to work very well with someone else's MPLS, just because those two core networks would kind of clash. So that's something that we definitely need to take into consideration when we're architecting a solution, understanding both the current state and the future state of the network. So as we touched on a little bit of security, and just kind of going into that in a little bit more detail here, every SD-WAN solution, or almost every, maybe 95%, is going to have a very basic layer 7 stateful firewall built in. And so that's going to replace, for example, a Cisco ASA, but not necessarily, Cisco ASA with firepower, or a Meraki or a Sonic Wall. So it's going to be straightforward, basic firewall capabilities. All traffic from site to site is going to be encrypted, and you're going to have control of application policies, segmentation within the network, and to be able to split tunnel, multi-tenancy and role-based access control, and sort of key rotation authentication, meaning you can't just add any device to your network and no one else can kind of get in and change your policies, but instead, when you deploy a new site, it has to authenticate with the SD-WAN controller, and then you could start to push templates and policies down to it. So some solutions then will go further than that and will actually include, a next-gen firewall or even UTM capability and feature set. And some of those, for example, actually I'll go into that, I think, on the next slide. But some of those, come from traditional firewall providers like Fortinet and somewhat Cisco there, and now Palo Alto will fit into that category, and potentially replacing an entire next-gen firewall deployment and allowing for sort of that fully secured breakout at the edge and avoidance completely of maybe a data center backhaul. And then on the other hand, some of the SD-WAN vendors or MSPs have built their solutions from the ground up to encompass both security and SD-WAN. Versa Networks is a great example of that on the bottom left. And then as we talked about, most solutions having that, at least that basic firewall built in. So that includes the likes of VMware VeloCloud, Silver Peak, Ariaka, CloudGenix, several others that we could probably get into, PepLink, FatPipe, Cradlepoint, kind of fitting between those two models. But for the most part, every solution is going to fit somewhere in one of these buckets, many of them in the basic firewall bucket. So that comes into play when we're talking about architecture, when we're trying to figure out if we want to backhaul traffic to the data center, if we want to do everything with local breakout, maybe we want to look at a cloud firewall, or we want to do some kind of split tunneling where maybe certain applications are pushed out locally and then others are sent back to the data center because they're not trusted, and those go through the full security stack. And lastly here, in the time that we have left, we wanted to touch on a couple different promotions that are going on right now. So with the global pandemic, the way that businesses function is completely different now than it used to be. And many users are working from home, as I am, as probably everyone else on this call is right now, unable to go into a corporate office and therefore unable to easily connect to corporate applications, either over an IPsec VPN tunnel or over MPLS, or just within the same location over the LAN. And therefore, users often need a secure way to get back to their corporate applications. And traditional VPN solutions may not be designed or able to support a full workforce, whereas previously they maybe only supported a small subset of that. So as an example, if a business has 50 remote workers typically, but 500 overall, they may have only sized that VPN concentrator for 50 to 100, and now they have to support 500. So this particular promotion that we're highlighting right now is from Masergy, and their solution is basically to their cloud-based POPs globally, which leverage Fortinet technology. They're able to offer 100 concurrent VPN users, so 100 remote VPN users, and an IPsec tunnel to the data center. So if you sort of visualize this, and I don't know if I have, I don't think I have a diagram of this because I did, but it was very, very in-depth and not great for a PowerPoint. But basically what they're doing is they're connecting to your data center via that IPsec tunnel, and then all the remote users are connecting to that same POP, that Masergy POP, and so that kind of serves as a handshake between the two locations. And this is a $500 per month, so that's US dollars, but we can translate that obviously on a 3-month term, and then you can easily add 100 additional users at another $500 per month. So this is sort of a short-term commitment because of COVID and not necessarily knowing when that's all going to end, but it is a relatively easy way to solve that security requirement of still connecting users into the network. And one additional promotion that we also wanted to touch on here, so Ariaka, and we do have a diagram on the bottom, but it's not necessarily the most helpful. It's a little bit in depth, but what this one is solving for isn't necessarily the security of encrypting that traffic back into the data center, but this is more so solving for performance. So this is best for distributed workforces, potentially across multiple countries or even multiple continents. And what we're doing here is, so local offices and local VPN concentrators, if we had users in Asia that are connecting back to a data center in Europe, historically, maybe they sat in an office in Asia and connected over the WAN back to that data center in Europe. But now, if they're all remote within Asia, they might be seeing really terrible performance connecting back to a VPN concentrator in Europe over the public internet, or even potentially trying to connect to a VPN concentrator in an Asia office, then back over the WAN, maybe that just doesn't have the scalability that they require. So what this solution does is it allows you to connect to Ariaka's private network, and they have a global private network that's really built for private traffic with very low latency, or as low latency as possible, because it is dedicated to corporate traffic and limited, if zero, packet loss and jitter. So what you do in this scenario is the remote users, in this case in APAC, would connect to the nearest Ariaka POP, and then they would ride the Ariaka backbone to get to that VPN server within the data center where the applications are hosted. So they can avoid going over the public internet, which is unpredictable and potentially very much congested, and they can still connect to the VPN. And so this would leverage a VPN concentrator that the client already has. And this is just solving for that sort of global performance element, whereas the previous solution is solving for actually the VPN concentrator piece. And we're getting close to the end of this presentation here, but the last thing I just kind of wanted to highlight as the key takeaways. So SD-WAN, it's really all about the applications. We're not necessarily focusing on the network or the network policies anymore. We're just trying to make sure that from a business perspective, we look at all the applications in play and we make sure that they deliver performance to end users that's better than acceptable, that isn't going to result in any complaints or problems across the network. And it's a very disruptive technology. So we could be replacing a private network. We could be replacing potentially even routers or firewall hardware all across the board. But it also doesn't have to be disruptive. So you can implement SD-WAN with the same routing and firewall technology, with the same existing network. Maybe you're using it as a migration tool. Maybe you're doing a proof of concept. You want to see how it performs with your existing private network and internet backup. And then as you start to see and prove it out, then you maybe start to do a network migration over to dual internet. You maybe start to replace your routers because you don't necessarily need that technology anymore, and so on and so forth. So it can be very disruptive, but that's certainly not a requirement. And lastly, we're saying it's easy here. You'll hear the word zero touch from many SD-WAN vendors. And I wouldn't say it's fully zero touch, right? You can't just ship a box out, have anybody plug it in, and it's going to work. But you do need to do some initial configuration and make sure the solution is kind of built to the specs of your network. And then potentially have someone talk it over on the phone with the administrator or the IT guy or whoever it is that's plugging it in and setting it up in an office. But it's still it's limited touch, if not zero touch. And for when you talk about existing solutions for the WAN, where you're potentially logging into command line and supporting every single site independently, SD-WAN is much, much easier than traditional WAN approaches. So it's kind of the easy button when you talk about deployment and management for a network, and integrating all the different connections together and really adding the resilience that you might need. And Jay, what's up?
Yeah, so just on that point then, in terms of, so obviously what I feel that what you're alluding to, good, we're into questions and answers already, so I'll kick off with the first question. So you're sort of alluding to private deployments there in the last bit that you were saying, and in terms of when you're going down this route of the hosted managed solution, how does that work in terms of that vendor? I'm assuming from previous deployments, and a majority of ours have really been, majority of ours have been around the actual private deployment. So in terms of that hosted deployments, do they assist you in that setup? Is that a process that they have their engineers come in and actually there is a full wrap service to deliver SD-WAN for you, where they delivered configured boxes for you? How does that all work?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And really the answer is yes to everything you just asked, but it could be as simple as just sort of doing the pre-configuration of those boxes based on the site templates that they've sort of designed in tandem with the client, help them identify their most critical applications and what that network design is going to look like at a given location, and then pre-configuring those, shipping them out. Maybe they're even going on site and helping you to deploy those, or maybe they're just talking you through it on the phone. And then, helping you really to make sure that everything is up and running smoothly. Maybe they're doing a proof of concept with you or a pilot to do those installs. Maybe they're teaching you how to do it for a subset of locations, and then you deploy it at the rest. But it's really kind of as little or as much as you need. Good.
So guys, I'm just going to quickly cover, because we're going to run up for an hour. So just before we dive into any direct questions from you guys over there as attendees, just going to quickly cover the actual process of engagement in terms of the way that we work with Avant and how that process works sort of moving forward. So fundamentally, the way that MBA work with Avant are a referral partner. So what that means, and Rob, you can maybe come in here and correct me if I get any of this wrong, right? But that's kind of Rob's bag. But fundamentally what that means is that as a customer, what will happen is that we will introduce you and sort of hold your hand with the vendors of choice. So we'll go through a process of identifying and pinpointing which vendors are relevant to the requirements that you have. And then throughout that process from there, essentially, Rob introduces us essentially to that vendor of choice or those vendors of choice. And then your account manager will go away and arrange sort of dates and times for you to jump on a call and start diving into the solution for you. And then thereafter, the real reason that we have so much success with Avant is that as a business, you get to take advantage of any of those offers that sort of Nico was alluding to there. And there is no real differentiation in price. So we work on a referral basis with the vendor, which means that essentially you sign the contract directly with the vendor. And in the background, what happens is we work on a referral commission basis with Avant. So that will never affect your price when you go to those vendors. Obviously, that differs in the fact that if you go to a reseller and work with a vendor directly and the contract goes through the reseller, then as you guys know, resellers are in business to make money, and therefore there's always going to be a slight pinch there in terms of the cost, right? So that really is the core reason that we've set up and working with Avant on. We work with them on UCAS and SD-WAN for hosted, right? And it really does work advantageously for you guys as customers. So I just wanted to state that. And in terms of the way that we sort of walk through that process, we have a standard template that your account manager would run through with you, which you can either run through yourself, or we can send you a sort of a HTML URL link that you can fill in all the details yourself. That gets submitted over to the Avant team, and then their engineering team, it might be Nick, it might be somebody else, that will get aligned to that opportunity. And from there, then essentially we will engage with the Avant team, identify your requirements, and then that will then go out directly to the vendor. So that's kind of the engagement process. Is there anything I've missed off? Rob?
No, absolutely perfect. He's nailed on the head there, Jay. Cheers. I would just add with that, and the reason why we have the ability to advise you on these things is we are agnostic in the marketplace. We have a vast portfolio, and we do a hell of a lot of research globally into all of these vendors. So, and that is all served up to our partners such as MBA. So, you know, it's there for you to utilize, and the idea is to save customers time in making those decisions by working with us who are doing this day in, day out.
Good, thanks. That's great. Okay, so should we open up for questions then, Nico and Rob? Is there anybody there, any of the attendees there that have any questions that they may want to ask? I've got a couple that I want to kick out, but anybody that's in there, if there's any questions that you have, please ask those now. This is the tumbleweed moment.
I can start with one that Rob sent me that I think was asked earlier, but it was addressing China in particular, because it can be very difficult to integrate China within a wide area network. And so that's first of all, a great point. And it can be difficult to even, ship devices and get an approved vendor. But the biggest difficulty with China is really getting around the Great Firewall, if you will, leveraging internet circuits to get in and out of China to other parts of the US or parts of the UK, or wherever that data center may be. And with that traffic being inspected by the firewall, adding a ton of latency and potentially being blocked depending on what you're trying to access. So the best way to get around that and to address that from a corporate perspective is leveraging a private network that's potentially within China. So I know we talked about moving to completely internet, and that's fine in many cases. But with China, we look at potentially vendors like Ariaka and Masergy, who have that core backbone that you can essentially leverage internet to get to their backbone, and then use their backbone to get around globally and solve that middle mile. So both of them have POPs within the mainland of China, so you can connect to them using internet and then ride their private backbone, which completely avoids the Great Firewall for your corporate traffic to get from China to wherever it needs to go, and vice versa. So we've had a ton of success with them. Ariaka actually proactively advertises China as one of their best their best solutions, and they do proof of concepts. They tell you, bring us your most difficult sites and let us solve for those, to kind of convince you of how good our solution is. So
yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, great. Yeah, I think more than anything that's the core of my questioning is obviously in terms of And out of the portfolio, Nico, that you have, are all of the vendors that are in that portfolio, are they all international hosted solutions? And is there any, I guess, rather than me asking you which countries they do, is there any countries maybe that we should know that they don't do that we should pinpoint here?
Yeah, let me go back to that list just so I have it up.
Sure.
So I think that there's definitely limitations. So depending on the vendor that you're talking about, they may or may not be able to address every location. And it comes down to a couple things, but it comes down to, you know, where are they able to ship, you know, where are they approved to get devices in versus having to ship it to you at your location, and then you have to get it to your site on your own. So that can be a pain point. And then also when it comes down to those with sort of a private network, do they have POPs? Do they have presence locally? Or are you going to have to send your traffic, you know, 10 countries over with a ton of latency just to get onto their backbone? So I'm not going to necessarily give you a specific answer there because it is going to vary per provider. But what I will say is, you know, highly regulated countries can be challenging, especially for those, you know, equipment vendors who are going to have a hard time getting something over to you. And then those network vendors, you just need to understand, you know, where is their point of presence and how does it fit into the overall architecture.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Thanks very much. Good. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think we've covered pretty much every angle. Obviously, anybody that's in at the moment as attendees, please do engage with your account managers, and we can engage with the Avant engineering team initially to dive in a lot deeper. Obviously, we've really only just touched the edges here in terms of the depth that we can go in the weeds around delivering SD-WAN and, you know, the requirements that you will need and the market offer. So please do engage with us and let us talk you through that process and identify whether or not SD-WAN really is a fit for your business. And I feel that, you know, it's a fit for most businesses these days. It's just how much you need to use it, right? I was just laughing at Paul's comment. So yeah. So other than that, I think we're done. Thanks so much, Nico, for coming on and doing this. Very much appreciated, and Rob for putting it all together. And obviously Luca's hiding in the background because he's not had a haircut. But thanks very much. Yeah, you're very welcome, Paul, and all the other attendees. So thanks very much, guys. And I have recorded as well, so I'll get the recording sent round to everybody that's attended as well.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Jay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers then, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nico. Cheers,
All right,
guys. Bye.